Hello, everyone. Blaine here with a quick word before the episode. I am normally extremely picky about the audio quality. That's one of the reasons we record so far in advance. I'm a teacher, so having episodes recorded over a year in advance means I can edit in binges over the summer months without missing deadlines. With feedback episodes, we can't record that far in advance. The fact that this happened to get recorded the week before report card grades and comments were due was not a surprise, but I thought I could manage it despite being extremely busy. What I didn't know in advance is that the weekend we recorded would also be the weekend that our dishwasher died, our washing machine jammed, and our toddler got sick. I was under enough time pressure that I even experimented with new noise removal settings and accidentally overwrote the original recording of my own voice before learning that those settings were cranked far too high, and the system tried removing noise that isn't there. Sadly, that means I sound very hollow this week. I also generally like to remove every every breathing noise, and so forth when I edit. Since this was already a day late, that simply wasn't an option, so this is a little more raw than you're used to. This is my 1800th podcast release since I started in 2012, and it's only my 4th late episode, so I hope you'll forgive me. If you can't, know that I alone am to blame, and that Jon had no part in these delays. It was the dawn of the third age of podcasting, 30 years after the series had launched.
The Babylon podcast was a dream given form. Its goal, to discuss the place where humans and aliens could work out their differences peacefully.
It's a port of call, home away from home for established fans, newbies, Jon, Blaine, and guests.
Humans and aliens wrapped in 2,500,000 tons of spinning metal, all alone in the night.
It can be a dangerous place.
Wait, what?
But it's our last, best hope for peace.
This is the story of the last of the Babylon stations.
The year is 2024.
The name of the podcast is
Babylon 5, 30 years later.
Hello and welcome back to Babylon 5, 30 years later. The podcast that is taking you on a journey through the hit classic science fiction drama Babylon 5, 30 years after it was released. I'm John Wilson, and with me on this journey is my friend Blaine Dowler. Hi, Blaine.
Hi, Jon. How are you doing?
I am doing all right. This episode is not the 30th anniversary of the transmission of a regular Babylon 5 episode, because we are in a transmission break, which means it's time for specials.
Mm-hmm.
And today our special involves you, the listeners. It's feedback time, y'all. We got emails, we got YouTube comments, we have a Candygram. This girl showed up at my door and started singing to me about Babylon 5. It was great. So yeah, we're going to talk about what y'all have to say about what we have to say, and then you'll be able to hear what we have to say about what you have to say about what, it's going to become this whole back and forth chain. It's fun.
All right, so shall we get started?
I mean, I don't have anything better to do.
All right, so the last feedback episode was after Season 1, Episode 8. The feedback we have this time is all from Episode 9 through 14, but just want to let everyone know, if you're finding the podcast later and you have feedback about Episode 3, right, we're not excluding that feedback, we just didn't get any this time, so we could have 2 episodes left in the series, and you're going, hey, here's feedback on episode 3, and when we do our next feedback special, that'll be in there.
It's a good point, because I always feel kind of awkward sending in feedback, way after the fact on a podcast. So yeah, just, if you're listening to this and it's been a year, that's cool. Send in your thoughts on the first season while we're talking about the second, and we will read it whenever we get to it.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it provides nice contrast, especially in this series where there's so much foreshadowing.
Yeah, because we're recording this as we're, half to 2/3 of the way through season 3. And yeah, stuff has changed.
Yes, our next recording will be season 3, episode 14.
Mm-hmm. Oh, almost the exact same point in the season.
Almost, yep. All right, so going through these, we are organizing it not in terms of the chronological order the feedback came in, but we're doing it in the flow of the episode. So we'll cover feedback on Deathwalker first, then Believers, then Survivors, and so forth.
This first comment you're going to read, I don't know if we gave credit where it was due last time, but I really like the pun in the name Mahatma Randy. That's really cool. I like that.
Yes. Yeah. And I do remember we were listing the YouTube tags. So yes, we've heard a lot of feedback from Mahatma Randy 5977, and it is all welcome. Please keep going. So, and we do have some feedback from people we did hear from last time coming up as well. So Mahatma Randy's first comment on Deathwalker was, "That was very interesting about the speaking and non-speaking makeup. I did not know that. I think they really needed to do something notable with Kosh, who was almost feeling like he was vanishing into the background at this point. If nothing else, it was to remind us that he was here. I really liked that he was essentially getting Talia's off switch, or so it seemed at the time, which implied she was a threat to him. I asked JMS if Mr. Abbott was an early draft of a techno-mage. He said no. I asked him the same question about the Ikaran warrior from Infection, and he said no about that one too. In that case of Abbott, I'm 100% sure he was telling the truth. In the case of Infection, I think he was being a bit less honest for whatever reason." He's got Senator Hidoshi in brackets there as a reply. I'm not sure if that reply to Senator Hidoshi was meant for this comment or not. But what I found churning through all the feedback from JMS, what he's saying on Usenet, if you think about it in terms of a sworn oath for court testimony where you tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, everything I've seen, he tells the truth and nothing but the truth. He doesn't always tell the whole truth, and I've only seen two types of situation in which he doesn't tell the whole truth. One is that doing so would spoil upcoming story points that have not yet been released. So he doesn't always tell the whole truth when it's not his truth to tell. That's the second situation. We can elaborate on that a little bit more later, because some of those are also spoilers. But yes, there are times when people have left the show for medical reasons that they did not want publicized because it would make it hard for them to get guest starring work. So we didn't know that there were medical reasons for their departure for decades.
But all that to say, his reason for saying that there's a no on this could be multiple. We haven't actually gotten to techno-mages in the story yet. So whether or not these two characters are early examples of techno-mages, I guess, is anyone's guess.
Yeah, well, we'll let people weigh in when we actually get to that point and everybody knows what they are.
And I don't think we would consider the use of the word technomage a spoiler. There's no context for the term. It's just a thing. So we'll just leave that in. So our next comment comes also from Mahatma Randy on the same episode, Deathwalker. He says, "I hadn't heard the quote about taking an honorary commission in order to work on Babylon 5 before. That certainly does happen. In the U.S. Navy, for instance, it's often easier for them to commission a civilian medical professional as an ensign to hire them as a civilian contractor. Particularly in peacetime, when enlistment is generally pretty low, and it can be hard to get everyone you need when you need them. I don't think that's the case with Dr. Franklin, though, and it probably was the case for Dr. Kyle. And Mahatma Randy includes some comments about why he doesn't think that's the case with Dr. Franklin that have to do with things that we don't know yet about Dr. Franklin. So we're going to save those for another conversation another time.
Yeah, I will say that, yes, on the Usenet forums with AOL Online, JMS definitely confirmed that Dr. Kyle was there with an honorary commission, and it would be as the medical officer working with the Earth Force, so you did not need a commission to open up a shop in the Zocalo. But if you were part of the station management on the Earth Force station, then you did.
Which would make sense. It would not make sense Zocalo is a commerce place. To have to be military in order to open up a shop there would not make sense. But if you're providing government or military sponsored services, such as medical help on a military station, that would make sense. The idea of being commissioned in the field is something that I've heard about from other stories. I have absolutely zero military experience beyond stories and the fact that my dad was military. But him being military does not make me military. I only say that because we actually know somebody who claims military status because her dad was military. But anyways, so yeah, it is a thing, and it's kind of cool to have that somewhat unusual circumstance incorporated into the story here.
Okay, So our next piece of feedback is an email from Scott McFadden. The subject is thoughts on Deathwalker and Believers. So he says, "Hi guys. Before I comment on anything else, let me say that it was fascinating to learn that the first suggestion for this podcast was that it was to be about Super Friends. Blaine, I just want to let you know that I would follow the hell out of a Super Friends podcast, so if you ever find somebody to do it with, I am there for it. I'm sure it probably doesn't hold up today, but when I was a kid, the Super Friends was definitely my jam." And yeah, a bit of an aside before I read the rest of the email. For me, the itch I was trying to scratch was to get back into TV, and I wanted to do it with John, so I threw out Super Friends because I figured anything involving Superman he will want to watch.
In theory, yes. And I did watch it. Do I want to revisit it and talk about it? No.
Yeah, that's been my experience trying to watch it on hand, because I do have everything on DVD, and yeah, it doesn't hold up that well today. There's maybe 2 seasons with ongoing story arcs, so it might be worth dipping into, just Challenge of the Super Friends or just Galactic Guardians, which were rebranded at some point.
And really, the phrase ongoing story arcs is extremely generous with those 2 seasons.
Extremely, but they're the only ones where there is a start and an end point to the stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
and they're fine. I don't want to slam on anybody else's love for Super Friends. I mean, if you like what you like, and that's totally great. I watched them all because I wanted to be exhaustive in my Superman exposures, and once was enough.
Yeah, they did a fantastic job of reaching the target audience, but that target audience is very young. So I think that's where we're both at. We're not super excited to watch it a second time. It was about finding something that John might be interested in doing that I didn't already see strong representation for. So there's already Lois and Clark New Adventures of Superman podcasts out there and such. So anyway, continuing with Scott's email. As to the podcast you are actually doing right now, it was interesting to consider these 2 episodes back to back, mostly because of my varying memories of them. I have almost no memory of Deathwalker at all, which is odd because it's a pretty solid story, with some very good performances from Andrea Thompson and Sarah Douglas. You'd think that, if nothing else, the image of the vicar with his computerized head would have stuck in my memory. But no. So it was kind of fun to see this episode as if it were new. The idea of immortality has always been fascinating to me, although I tend to side with the idea that immortality would probably end up being more of a curse than a blessing. I love the conclusion of the episode where the Vorlons solve the problem by blowing up Jadur's ship. It's both a character beat, Vorlon's gonna Vorlon, and to hell with what anybody else wants, and also relieves JMS of the need to actually start dealing with the implications of having a bunch of immortal characters running around. By contrast, I remember Believers quite well. Who could forget it, really? As you say, it's a tough episode to watch, and especially tough to rewatch knowing what's coming. This episode is really a tour de force for Richard Biggs, and is one of the earliest episodes to give us a look at Dr. Franklin's moral convictions. There's also some good work from Michael O'Hare in Sinclair's growing conflict with Franklin, his compassion in his conversation with Sean, and finally the way that he makes peace with Franklin at the end. This is one of those classic, use science fiction to metaphorically examine a real-world issue stories. As in the best of these kind of things, there are no easy answers. So a couple of strong episodes in the first season, which bodes well for the future. My memory is that I enjoyed the latter half of season 1 more than I did the earlier half, as some of the ongoing story began to be revealed and it started to become clear that this was something more than just an episodic sci-fi show. We'll have to see if this memory holds up. Best to you guys, Scott McFadden.
I think it will. Sometimes I wonder about the being in the headspace of somebody who was watching this on its first broadcast, because this does feel very much like an episodic sci-fi show at this point. The idea that there's an ongoing story to be had there are only a few inklings of that right now. And they're kind of on the level of, let's introduce a concept at the beginning that we're going to deal with like 2 times over the course of the season, climactically at the end. And that's our ongoing story to hold things together. That's sort of what it feels like at this point, even though of course there's more that's not evident.
Yeah. As we've been saying, as I found when I was, doing the giving form to the dream segments, there was so much more than I realized. So much more.
But yeah, the Vicar and the Deathwalker and stuff, that was a thing. Believers was a lot more of a, nice moral quandary episode. couched in science fiction elements. Our next comments are also about Deathwalker and Believers from Ryan Wilson. And he says, hello to the Babylon 5 crew. I guess that's us. We are the Babylon 5 crew. Ryan says, Deathwalker is the episode I would use to introduce new people to the show. I guess I just liked Kosh dialogue and genocidal alien cats. Okay. He says, this is the first episode where it struck me as strange that Sinclair was both commander of the station and the ambassador to Earth on the station. I would imagine it's a budget issue, so they don't have to cast 2 actors. It's not a major problem, but it is something I noticed. Does that feel like it might possibly or potentially be a conflict of interest to be an ambassador from Earth and also military commander of the station?
To me, I think the conflict of interest might come in if you're working for an Earth government that has goals that are contradictory to the mission statement in Babylon 5. So I guess it depends on what orders you're acting under.
Okay, yeah. Because if he had to do something as commander of Babylon 5 that was contrary to the diplomacy, that would be a problem. Yeah. So having both of those roles in one person is actually potential for conflict. Okay. I like that. He says, Ryan says, I don't know if we ever get into why the Dilgar are gone. If so, I don't remember. Did their sun go Nova? And you were looking up and you said this was the only appearance of the Dilgar?
Yes, and in the backstory in this episode, they do say that after the war ended, their sun did go supernova. So Jadur was the only one left, because apparently, even though they could fight an interstellar war, they had not colonized other worlds.
Jakar has 7 blood oaths. I don't think we ever see them, but I hope they are against people with nicknames like Fancy Talker, Grumpy Reader, or Silly Dancer, instead of Deathwalker. The novel that we're going to talk about in the future involves a Jakar blood oath, but I think it's related to these events, not a different one, right?
Yeah. It continues with a blood oath that we've seen before.
Yeah, okay. As for Talia's storyline, I think I remember where it goes, and I think by the time you read this, you'll know as well. Oh yes, Ryan, we know. Listeners watching along with the podcast won't, though, so we can discuss whenever you get there. I didn't realize the foreshadowing started this early, but that's Babylon 5 for you. We're going to have a conversation about Talia, so y'all out there in listening land, make a note. We need to talk about Talia whenever we get to the end of Talia. And Ryan says, Believers, I still don't know how I feel about this one. I guess I come down on Sinclair's decision since he actually spoke to the boy before deciding. I'm impressed that Blaine was able to find arc foreshadowing in this episode that I had always assumed was a one-off episode designed to make viewers sad. I can't remember what the arc foreshadowing was that you found in the episode.
Honestly, neither do I. So.
It does feel very contained within the story for the episode. And I like Ryan's point that Sinclair was the one who actually spoke to the kid. That kind of insight is often passed over in stories like this. To ask the child what they want, I think is key in a situation like this. I wish I had more to say, Ryan says, but I think you guys covered it pretty well, and I hate how it all turns out. That's no commentary on the writing or acting, both of which I think were great. More next time for episodes 11 and 12. Yeah, I mean, Believers definitely has a disturbing ending, but that's the nature of the story, and probably the only real way it could have ended.
Yeah, the point of that episode was to punch you in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And it does that. So, mission accomplished. Does. Yes, it's a lot less funny than one might expect from the same guy who wrote The Trouble with Tribbles.
He's written a lot more of The Trouble with Tribbles.
So our next comment came from the Yum Yum podcast again. This time was also on Believers on YouTube, saying, this won't be the last time seeing Trisha O'Neill on Babylon 5.
Alrighty. And from user-XU2SJ9VD6B, whom we're just going to call Charles. Charles says they mentioned that the problem with cutting was the cutting of the air sac. It's not just any cut that they are opposed to.
And then Mahatma Randy 5977 replies directly to that saying, Do they? I don't remember that. I remember Franklin saying they'd have to cut the air sac, but I don't remember the parents objecting to that specifically, just cutting in general.
They may have initially contested in the context of a discussion of cutting the air sac, but I think it's pretty clear through all of their various comments that, God's chosen people don't get cut. That's not a thing that they're supposed to do, because the soul is contained in the body and it will be released if the body is cut in a way that animals don't have to worry about because they're food. So, yeah, I think that we can't overemphasize one particular element because the rest of the context adds to it. Mahatma Randy also said on Believers, JMS once said that if he co-wrote a script, he would just give the exclusive credit to the other writer because he's already got a show. He doesn't need the money or the exposure. He's set. That said, he said most, if not all, of the episodes on the show were written solely by the people they were credited to. Anyway, he said this in the first or second season. I don't remember exactly when. I think we've had a lot of conversations about when we are able to know specifically which elements were added in by JMS. But I think other than those elements, the show episodes are largely written by the credited writer, with the exception of any, standard TV edits and stuff that get done during the production of a TV show.
Yeah, going through the script books by the other writers, more than one of them have commented about how Babylon 5 showed more of their original script than most other shows do. So there's summary writing, but they're saying typically, as a work for hire, you're lucky if 55% of your script gets on screen. And they're saying it's more like 85 to 90% in Babylon 5. And they've been putting out, so I think in Believers, it was the bits about Ivanova dealing with the Raiders. I think that was this episode. It's been a while. But there is an episode where there's a subplot with Ivanova dealing with Raiders that was not in the original writer's script.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about other scenes like that where scenes are added in because he needs things to be happening in the episode that aren't part of the main story of the episode. Yeah.
Or I think it was DC Fontana mentioned in her first script she hadn't quite found Garibaldi's voice yet, so JMS rewrote some of his dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might have been Larry DiTilio. She credited JMS, but DiTilio said it was technically his job in that first season to do that. So whoever was doing it, it got done.
But there's also a good difference between somebody coming up with the story and coming up with the gist of the dialogue and somebody else polishing the flavor of it for the character versus having a scene completely redone by someone else. Those are two different levels of rewrite. You're polishing somebody else's writing versus replacing it with your own writing.
Yeah, very much so. All right, so our next comment on Believers is also from Mahatma Randy. So he says, I wondered about the accidental cutting thing as well. The no prize I came up with was that infectious diseases ran rampant on their planet, and any kind of significant abrasion made them sick or had them sick at some point in the past, resulting in the taboo. The father says to his recovered son, what demon are you? Which is where I got the idea from. A lot of societies equate disease with demonic possession, or at least certain kinds of diseases. At the same time, the line about only cutting food. A lot of societies equate disease with demonic possession, or at least certain kinds of diseases. At the same time, the line about only cutting food animals argues to the contrary.
I wouldn't necessarily say it was to the contrary, because animals, according to their logic, animals don't have souls, so the idea of possession wouldn't even apply. But putting that in with the concept of people getting cut, I do like the approach you came at this, Randy, with trying to find anthropological origin for the belief. The idea that if they were really prone to disease and sickness from abrasions, that could definitely cause, cultural taboos or ideas to develop. So that could be an origin for the belief. I like that.
Yeah, so do I. And I think that the food animals point I don't know if it is that contrary, because usually by the time you're cutting a food animal, they don't have time to get infected with anything because they're dinner.
And I guess I would just imagine these people don't believe in eating soul food. Sorry, that's a bad joke. Next is also Mahatma Randy. I think he was probably typing as he was watching, which is cool. It's like we got live tweeted his reactions to the episode. So he says, "My husband wishes me to tell you that it is forbidden for him to forgive you, but if he could, he would." Great line. "What gives you the right to play God? Every person who comes into my hospital." Again, great line. Sinclair seems to have been raised Catholic and seems very knowledgeable about it, but I always get the feeling that it doesn't scratch his itch and he's kind of looking for something else. Somewhat similar to another character saying that his beliefs are rather a la carte. I remember when Babylon 5 started, I was not really sold on whether or not I liked the show. There was usually like one scene per episode that I really, really liked, but I wasn't sure if the show was good, and part of it seemed very, very slapdash. Then about 7 episodes in, they said something that seemed to contradict something they had said in an earlier episode, but I wasn't sure, so I grabbed a pen and started scribbling down what I could remember about the world building from the previous episodes, and before I realized what had happened, I had filled up 3 pages with notes, and I was staggered by how much world building they had done in just 6 episodes. I remember I was living in Atlanta at the time, and I talked to a friend at work the next day and said that they had done more world building in 6 episodes than Star Trek The Next Generation had done in 6 years. I don't remember what the contradiction was, but I do remember concluding that it was not a contradiction. I really like that story. That is a fantastic story. Like, and he would have been doing this just off memory, and unless he happened to get a chance to watch the episodes and reruns. It sounds like he's doing this just thinking off the top of his head what the show had done so far. That's pretty neat. Randy goes on to say, "I remember when I first watched this episode," and again, he's talking about Believers, "I was annoyed by it because I was sure it was going to be another Jiffy Pop Next Generation style episode where there's a techno-babble solution at the end, or the people kind of realize that their beliefs are stupid, or some cheat ending like that. And when that didn't happen, I was stunned and impressed." Yeah, we talked about that. The differences between this kind of storytelling and other kinds of sci-fi storytelling.
Yeah, I think we all had that same reaction to that ending. That really sets it apart from the Star Treks, the other franchises, that you'd expect them to struggle with it, and then at the end find an actual solution that makes everyone happy.
What'd you think about his comment at the beginning about how Sinclair feels like it was raised Catholic, but that just didn't quite scratch his itch, so he was looking for something else?
It could be. From what I know of Mahatma Gandhi, outside of this, he is one of the most knowledgeable people when it comes to Christian theologies and their history of people I've ever met. Because we are friends in other contexts, and at one point, 2 of my Facebook friends were having a debate on my Facebook timeline about theology. And the person who had just finished her master's degree in theology conceded that Randy was correct when she double-checked his facts. Mm-hmm. So I don't think he's got an actual degree in it, but I suspect you could stick him in a room with people who did, and he could walk out with an honorary doctorate.
Right.
So,
and as far as the actual portrayal of Sinclair, would you say that he feels Catholic or ex-Catholic?
I would say he feels somewhat Christian. He was raised by the Jesuit priests, so that was sort of part of it. But yeah, it does feel more like a default position for him because that's how he was raised rather than a conscious choice because he's done the legwork and figured out, no, this is the right belief system for me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there may be a point there. And
yeah, I've kind of gotten the feeling from him as well that his perspective has a Christian foundation, but it's not necessarily the only perspective he's open to. And I have some experience in Quakerism, And in one of the two main branches of Quakerism, the idea is that all people have access to the light inside, and different people use different language to describe that based upon their backgrounds and their upbringing and everything. And so you have a lot of Quakers who come from different branches of Christian and non-Christian religious belief, and they may be used to be talking about God and spirituality in their own, terms, but those aren't the only terms people have. So that to say, I feel like Sinclair is probably approaching spirituality from a Christian vocabulary, but it's not necessarily, his perspective is not confined by that vocabulary. It's just expressed by it.
Yeah, I don't know if his, the actual rituals and the fine details of his belief are specific enough to distinguish whether he's actually behaving Catholic or, and he's incompatible with Protestantism or incompatible with baptism or the other flavors of Catholicism, or of Christianity, I should say. So yeah, I do think he is Christian, but yeah, when Randy says he's kind of looking for something else, that maybe. So Mahatma Randy's last comment on believers is, I always thought of the pilots were more like laying down. And yeah, we talked about how they were kind of standing in those chairs, but I think it would feel more like laying down because they would have the thrust behind them.
Yeah, they have a little bit of a forward angle to their bodies, but not laying horizontally, just laying not quite vertically. But you would be resting on the surface in front of you.
Yeah, and if you look at the axioms of Einstein's general theory of relativity, where he came up with the things for the general theory of relativity that laid the foundation for working gravity into his theory, it was when he realized that you can't tell the difference between standing in a box on a planet with heavier gravity than Earth or riding an elevator upward while on Earth. You just know that there's an extra normal force from the bottom of the elevator pushing up on your feet.
Mm-hmm.
So that same principle would apply to the pilots in the Star Furies. Because the thrust engines are behind them, right? They're going to feel pressed against what they are. So it is going to feel a lot like lying on a bed because that's where the pressure applies to your body. So
I remember when I was little and you're riding in an elevator and it slows down. It doesn't feel like it's slowing down. It feels like you reverse direction. And it's always kind of confused because we're going down and then suddenly it feels like we're going up. But when the doors open, we're still going down to the level. And it took me a while to figure out what exactly was going on there.
Yeah, our 2-year-old has recently discovered the fun of walking in the elevator while it's starting and stopping.
So, we then have a comment from Daryl Bentley, 6035. Is this Bentley's first comment?
I believe so.
Welcome to the show. Daryl says, excellent episode. Oh, and he's talking about 111 Survivors. So it's our beginning of our Survivors discussion. Excellent episode of the podcast and great interview with Mark. The behind the scenes facts are my favorite part of the podcast. I would never have thought that 30 years after first watching Babylon 5, that I'd be listening to a podcast celebrating the show. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you very much, Daryl. That's very nice to hear that we have people, more people discovering us.
More on Survivors. This was the episode where we were joined by episode writer Mark Scott Zickrey. Mahatma Randi replies or comments on YouTube with very nice, more comments to follow. So,
okay.
And perhaps those comments will come in our next feedback episode because we don't have them yet.
Well, we have another comment from Mahatma Randi after Ryan.
Yes, but not on that episode.
Oh, not on Survivors. Okay. Randy, you forgot to write about Survivors. Okay. So Ryan writes another email about Survivors and By Any Means Necessary. So he says 2 more episodes that I never really remember as well as I would like to. Well, Ryan, they were 30 years ago. He says, I think it's because Signs and Portents is much more memorable. Survivors. It's good to get some history from our security chief, but I agree that his alcoholism wraps up too quickly. Yeah, I remember that being a thing. I like that there's a bottle problem. I just think it should be more, but we talked about that in the episode.
Yeah.
Ryan says, more trouble on Earth. It's a good thing that president is a Babylon 5 supporter, at least. And Mindy and I were just recently watching Midnight on the Firing Line, where President Santiago was reelected. And in that episode, the way he's described, it's not the best. And so she's like, always that kind of guy getting put into office. And I just had to smile, because of knowing where things are going to go with that. And Ryan says, by any means necessary, another decent season 1 episode, but by no means a favorite of the season. It's interesting to see that labor issues are still a problem several hundred years from now, so the theme does resonate. I was listening to an episode of From Crisis to Crisis, a Superman podcast, which can be found at the Superman homepage or at the Fortress of Baileytude by Michael Bailey and Jeffrey Taylor. And they were talking about one of the Elseworlds Superman annuals that sort of did a very, very common theme in Superman imaginary stories, where in the story, because Superman is present, everything becomes utopian or becomes idyllic or whatever. And they're like, I just don't believe that Superman is enough to counteract humanity's ability to mess itself up. And I feel like this is an element of that even though it's 300 years from now, there's still going to be disparities between classes. There's still going to be a wealth gap. There's still going to be people working for almost nothing to feed those who already have a lot. And that resonates here very well.
Yeah, I think we're going to struggle with that because money buys power, and there are people who abuse their money to get more money. It seems like they're treating their bank balance as a high score, and that's all they care about.
Mm-hmm. And when you can use your points to rack up more points.
Yep.
Yeah. Ryan goes on to say, Sinclair resolving the issue without massive violence seems to be upsetting to the powers that be in EarthGov. Yes, they did not like that. I do like the scene where Ivanova forces everyone off the bridge. Sinclair showed remarkable patience in not arresting everyone, as far as I'm concerned. He could have done. I wouldn't expect a Star Trek captain to, but I wouldn't have been surprised if Sinclair had just said, you know what? Y'all are all under arrest. I mean, it wouldn't be a good move for him, not a good day, but I feel like it could be a day.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan says Sinclair showing a religious side is nice, and we get a nice Jakar moment, too. Nice Jakar moments are not as common in the first season. And Ryan concludes by saying not much to say about both these episodes. Onward to the next ones.
And the next one is a comment from Mahatma Randy on By Any Means Necessary. He says, I cannot overstate how hugely impactful and different this episode was at the time. I would put it down as a watershed event, one of those things that marked a change in the genre, albeit a slight one, and one that not many people noticed at the time. Suddenly, space was for blue-collar people as well. Hell, space involved physical labor. This was something in a lifetime of watching SF on TV I'd never seen before. Plots are always set in some idyllic future where everyone seems to have the same standard of living and the same education, including higher education, and we don't really see grunts and grease monkeys.
It's one of the things I like about Battlestar Galactica, because you do have a lot of emphasis on the lower people working hard, and as that show goes through some of its changes, the fact that there's a group of people working harder and suffering to make everything happen is a theme, and I like that. So seeing it here was cool too.
Randy continues, Scotty may crawl down a tube occasionally and futz with some tools, but even then he never gets dirty or sweaty, and most of the time he's just standing around pushing buttons. Ditto Space 1999 and Battlestar Galactica and any other SF series you care to name. Just going to step in here. I think Randy is referring to the 1978 Battlestar, whereas John was referring to the 2004, because that is an element that is definitely different between those two. So both people here made accurate comments. Randy continues, really the closest we ever see is in Lost in Space, where Maureen does laundry, and thanks to the labor-saving gizmos in the far distant year of 1997, she does it in about 30 seconds as a sight gag. This was the first show I could think of where space wasn't a glamorous career choice for the elite, but an actual place where all kinds of people lived and worked real-world jobs and stuff like that. And just like the real world, not everyone is treated fairly. People need to look out for their own interests in a non-utopian world, and there are non-governmental organizations to do that. Unions, holy hell, who would have thunk it? I love the idea that as we go out into space, we'll take our problems with us. The people in those other shows barely seem human. I later read that JMS was annoyed by this as well, and Garibaldi was included from the outset as a blue-collar working stiff. He's enlisted, not an officer. He didn't go to college, he's not an elite, his grandma was a Boston cop. It's never said that he grew up poor, but he certainly didn't grow up rich. There is a blue collar underneath that Earth Force gray. Seriously, this episode changed the kind of stories you could tell. Some of my military friends have singled out Sinclair in this episode. They say it really does capture the way a CO gets every problem dumped at his feet, sleep-deprived, having to deal with uncaring supervisors and angry subordinates, and particularly civilian contractors. I read an interview with O'Hare where he mentioned that much of his performance was based on his brother, who was a career Army officer, and just how he behaved in his off hours and so forth. I genuinely love the subplot with the Jaquan F. I disagree that Jakar isn't a bad guy. He's still a bad guy here, but he's a smart bad guy who's willing to pick his battles and won't start anything that doesn't have a clear advantage for him and his cause. I like him in this episode because he's caught uncharacteristically flat-footed by the situation, and is way more off balance than he normally is. I think this is the first episode where we really see there's more to him than a deceptively polite Machiavellian.
I think that's what I meant by the not bad guy comments, is that he's just becoming more complex, and in this case, more genuinely sympathetic.
Yeah, and I think with some of it we were thinking, well, he may be considered a bad guy from an Earth perspective, but not so much from the perspective of his fellow Narns. So it might be a bit of an ethical difference, especially since so many of his actions that cast him in a bad guy light were against the Centauri and the history that they have.
And in this particular storyline, he is the protagonist of this little plot, and Malari is the antagonist.
So Randy continues, the fact that he isn't just using his religion for political gain or power, he legitimately believes it. And I was clearly taken aback by Sinclair's ability to fix his problem in a genuine, albeit technical and legalistic fashion. Not surprising, since we're told Sinclair was partially educated by Jesuits. Honestly, I think this is the episode where he actually takes a step away from being a bad guy. And Londo is, as ever, a delightful a-hole taking glee in profaning a central ritual in the faith of his enemy. I also always like the line, "Bah, they're all pagans, still worshipping their sun." So yeah, I think good points there, especially about just that existence of the class structure. He's right, up to this point, prior to Babylon 5, sci-fi tends to fall into two categories. You get the utopias and the dystopias.
Mm-hmm.
Right, there's still a class structure in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, but the classes didn't even realize they came from the same source. It was so extreme in that. So I think, yeah, Babylon 5 is the first one that says, no, it's still somewhere in the middle, like we have been through the entirety of human history. Which I think is fair, because frankly, I think the biggest obstacle to creating a utopia is getting people to decide on what utopia looks like. If we all have the same picture of utopia, I think virtually every election would be almost a landslide or kind of pointless, because everyone would be promising the same things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the point he makes about how he's kind of surprised because he's approaching Sinclair from a sincere religious perspective, and he's just kind of surprised that Sinclair doesn't automatically uphold it. It's just, I don't know, given how some attitudes sometimes are in the real world regarding that sort of thing. But yeah, nice comments on the episode. I really like that comment. So we now have an email from Scott McFadden on By Any Means Necessary. He says, "Hi, fellas." Hi, Scott. "Just thought I'd send you brief notes about the episode By Any Means Necessary. I agree with your assessment that this was one of the better episodes that we've seen so far. The issues that it deals with were very real at the time, and unfortunately are still with us even 30 years later." Hey, that sounds like a good title for a podcast. "From the point of view of the greater ongoing Babylon 5 storyline, this episode isn't hugely important, but it's a very important episode in terms of Babylon 5 world building." I agree. And I think that goes in line with Mahatma Randy's comments too. This is introducing a concept of the world and its, gray areas, qualities that is important, even though we're not contributing to the plot. He says, "This is one of the episodes that really points out how Babylon 5 was distinct from, shall we say, some other science fiction shows of the time. Unlike a utopian vision of the future where all of humanity's petty little problems have been solved, in the Babylon 5 universe there are still things like conflicts between labor and management, political squabbling, and budget shortages leading to things being built with cheap materials. It's a problem we can recognize all too well, and one that can't be solved by recalibrating the deflector screens or anything like that." Would you like to reverse the polarity of the neutron flow? That's me. That's not Scott. Scott does say, "You just have to study the situation, come up with a creative solution, as Sinclair does here." This episode also has one of my favorite Babylon 5 quotes: "You should never hand someone a gun unless you're sure where they'll point it." And people say Sinclair was bland. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.
It's definitely good points. And a similar aside, when I got the third Doctor Sonic Screwdriver toy, basically, or the prop replica, I was very disappointed when the troubleshooting guide said, reverse the batteries if it's not working. Try turning the batteries around rather than reverse the direction of the electron flow.
The thing about Sinclair being bland, I don't know. When I was watching Deep Space Nine, it took me a while to warm up to Avery Brooks's performance because of the way that his face emotes. It's a lot more subtle than I think a lot of people's faces. And so if you're not really watching him, you don't really get what goes on in his face. There is a lot of emotion at play there. It's just the movements are smaller. And I think something similar can be said for Sinclair. He's not bland by any stretch of the imagination. It's just he's not as blatant, I guess, in how he emotes. And it's a more visual quality that you have to pay attention to get.
And I think both of those characters are the reputation I've seen from people who have military experience is that this is a fairly accurate representation of a military leader, including the restraint in displaying the emotions, because it's supposed to be about the chain of command and the greater good and not personal feelings and emotion. So I think it feels bland to people because they are acting that part well. That is part of what comes with that job. So when I've seen people online, people saying that, sometimes it's the people with military experience going, no, that's what the military commanders are like because they need to be to do their job right. So thanks for those thoughts, Scott. Actually, I think Survivors is the only episode of release that Scott has not sent input on. I don't know if that's because he didn't have thoughts. He's never obligated to send them in. But Scott, if you did have thoughts that you still feel like sharing, we'll welcome the email next time. So our next comment is on signs and portents. The comment came from Mahatma Randy 5977. He says, "It burns my butt that because DS9 ran 2 years longer, there are still to this day Trekkies who say, well, if B5 didn't suck, why did they get canceled so long before DS9? Deep seething breath." Well, part of that is, as we know, watching the show, JMS came in with a 5-year plan. The Star Treks of the era, so Next Gen, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, part of the reason Next Gen survived because that first season was weak. I have learned
The
that
first 2 seasons were weak.
They were. I was rewatching season 1 from the start. I've often said the only reason it survived is because of the Star Trek brand. I've since learned at the time it was the most expensive show to produce in television history. But one of the reasons it survived so long is because their syndication contract that they wrote to get things on the air was a 7-year contract where apparently stations were not paying for the right to air it up front. Instead, they were paying the production company a percentage of the ad space they sold, which meant airing it was guaranteed to be profitable for every TV station or that picked up the syndication package, because there was zero upfront cost. It was only a share of whatever advertising you could sell. So that's why they did it, and that's why Next Gen and Deep Space Nine, and eventually Voyager, because it made the transition partway through its run. But that's why those 3 ran 7 seasons. It's because that's how long that advertising contract was in place. So, yeah, Babylon 5 didn't suck. It made it to 5 seasons, which for straight up science fiction, Star Trek is the only series considered sci-fi that lasted longer than 3 seasons. So making it to 4 and 5 should count as a triumph for Babylon 5. Battlestar Galactica was 1. Space 1992 or 1999 was 2, and the only reason it got season 2 was because Fred Freiberger came in. He's often compared to the euthanasia doctors because he tends to be the showrunner in the last season of a show, like he was last season of Star Trek, last season of Space 1999. From what I'm digging up from behind the scenes comments and all of those, he's more like the hospice care doctor where the show was already unprofitable. And the network was saying the only way we'll keep the show on the air is if you can get the budget down below this number. And Freiberger was brought in because he could. He would keep producing a show on a greatly reduced budget. So.
And what's interesting is when you get to a show that does not have that built-in 7-year contract, Star Trek Enterprise, what happens? It almost gets canceled after 3 and does get canceled after 4. And which is a tragedy for that show because just like Star Trek The Next Generation, season 4 is when Star Trek Enterprise hit its stride. It didn't get the benefit of seasons 5, 6, and 7. I think the same could be said for Deep Space Nine. I'm in season 4 of Deep Space Nine right now, and that show really feels like it has become something it really wasn't in the first 2 and maybe 3 seasons. The addition of Worf is probably part of that. So yeah.
Part of that, and Ira Steven Behr taking over as showrunner partway through season 3. So season 3, he was still on the existing plan. And then seasons 4 through 7 were more, that was Behr's sensibility. So yeah, those 2 elements are the big ones with Deep Space Nine.
So Babylon 5 got to finish its story. In modern day terms, Star Trek Discovery is going 5 seasons. I'm not sure if they wanted to go longer. I feel like they've done a lot of what they set out to do, and are probably going to be ending on a feeling of satisfaction and completion, not in a feeling of canceling while we're still going strong. So yeah, Babylon 5 didn't end because it sucked. Babylon 5 ended because the creator said that's the end of the story.
Yeah, and we will get into that in much more detail as we go, because one of the things we will learn at the time is before Babylon 5 ended, they knew the spin-off was coming. So they were not done with the universe. This is more like wrapping up Next Generation, but Deep Space Nine hadn't quite premiered yet. It would still be in pre-production. That would be a better comparison, which honestly that would have been the case had Next Gen wrapped up with season 5 because their story was told. Deep Space Nine premiered halfway through Next Gen season 6.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a similar timeline aside from, not needing to pad. And just for the record, Discovery, they always knew that after their contracted episodes, there was no guarantee of a new season. So I think they knew they had 2 seasons from the start, and then they got renewed for 3 and 4 at the same time. And when they were renewed for 5, it wasn't 5 and 6. So they weren't guaranteed it was going to end there, but they knew it was a possibility. So they did have ideas for where they wanted to go with a season 6, but they were not, on the whole, completely shocked when they found out they weren't getting one. So there's an extra, I think, 20 minutes of footage or so in that series finale that wasn't actually directed by the credited director, because they came back and did it after the fact to give the show some closure. That part was directed by Jonathan Frakes.
Okay. Mahatma Randy's next comment on Signs and Portents is a quote, "Turn their bones into flutes for our children." Just one of my favorite dark, intimidating lines ever. Yeah, that was gross and fun.
Mahatma Randy's next comment was, "Side note, I spent several hours talking to Harlan about The City on the Edge of Forever and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and he told me a whole bunch of stuff about the production of the first season as a whole and cast interaction that were not commonly known, such as why Yeoman Rand got fired. He also talked about the budgeting issues on the episode, which are somewhat exaggerated. We also talked about B5 a lot."
Because Harlan Ellison is a creative consultant on a lot of the episodes. He and Straczynski worked together on the show.
Yeah.
To an extent.
Yes, and Yeoman Rand, played by Grace Lee Whitney. Yeah, that was... when that Me Too wave hit, Whitney had stories.
Mm-hmm.
She'd been quietly sharing them without naming names, but we could put some pieces together. It was... There was a lot of push and pull in why Yeoman Rand disappears from the show.
It was good to see her in the films, though.
Yep.
Mahatma Randy then says, "A lot of the alien signage is English written with a substitution cipher. So there's a lot of hidden gags among the signs if you can freeze frame and if you have the key. The black market basketball thing has long made me wonder if it's a reference to the old American flag, that's flag with 2 G's, comic by Murray Chaykin. Black market basketball is a big part of that series. The sport is illegal for whatever reason. I've heard of American flag. I have never read American flag. I think there was a more recent revival of it, because when he said old comic, I was thinking more modern comic, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah, it did come back. I think the original run was the 80s, and it came back in the 2010s. I also thought it was Howard Chaykin rather than Murray.
It might be a casual name versus official pen name. I don't know. His name is Howard Victor Chaykin. So yeah, it could just be a typo on there. In any case, I'm not really remembering the black market basketball comment or context.
Yeah, I actually haven't gotten around to reading it yet, but yeah, the original run went from 1983 to 1989, published by First Comics.
Yeah. Do you know what the black market basketball context was for the episode?
No, I think the black market basketball is part of American flag, so I'm...
It says this made me wonder if it's a reference to American flag.
Yeah. Could be. I don't really remember that from Signs and Portents. I have not been rewatching them with you, so...
Okay. The idea of an alien signage being English just in code is fun. I have no idea how I would go about getting a key to that. I thought I was doing really well to realize that Zocalo, the sign for Zocalo, was just English letters, very stylized, because at first glance that does not look like English writing.
No, not at first glance. But that's okay. People are making weird font choices today. There's no reason to think that problem would go away either.
I just read the first issue of the 90s Superboy series where he meets the Legion for the first time. And the Legion, of course, being them from the future, are speaking the language of the future, which is Interlac. And so it's the very first time that they put a cipher in the comic for the dialogue. All of the Legionnaires in that issue are speaking Interlac, and it's a symbol cipher for English. They did print the key in the letters column, but it makes getting through that issue a lot longer because of all of the translating you have to do along the way. It was a little bit tedious, but it was fine. And I think this becomes a thing occasionally with Legion comics, but this is the first time they did it.
That sounds like someone needs to do a Google Translate style app where you just hold your phone over the page and it does the swap for you.
Someone should get on that.
Yes. All right, so Mahatma Randy's last comment on Sign's importance on our YouTube channel was, "This episode absolutely blew me away the first time I saw it. I was already pretty sold on the show, but it wasn't remarkable up to that point. Interesting, consistent, good world building, well paced, but not really remarkable. It hadn't hit a level of ambition that marked it as something truly different from Trek or Deep Space Nine or whatever. And then this one happened. And this was just masterfully written and directed and shot all the way through. First of all, I cannot tell you how refreshing it was to see actual strategy used in a battle sequence the way Sinclair manipulates the Raiders, and then closes the box almost entirely unique in American science fiction TV. Seriously, the only previous times I could remember anybody using any kind of detailed strategy was back in 1978 in the first half of the Battlestar Galactica TV series, and that strategy was used by the Cylons. In general, science fiction has just been shoot, shields down to 15%, shoot harder, hooray, shooting harder worked. Secondly, I have to mention, this episode was just gorgeous. In particular, the wonderful series of transitions from the coffee cup to the Raider ship, to the scenes inside the Raider ship, to the Shadow ship showing up and cutting the Raider vessel to ribbons, then back to the coffee cup with that still reflected in it, and then the woman drops it and it shatters on the floor. That was some absolutely amazing shot composition. Beautiful and amazingly well composed. The shimmery fade-in of the Shadow ship, which we never really got a good look at, was pretty amazing, as well as the notion of Centauri court politics. Golly, it is fanon that the Raider ship was named Dame Fortune. It's actually one of my favorite assigns from B5. And Mr. Morden is just wonderful. He has that fantastic something wrong about that guy aspect of him that is immediately apparent, but he is so affable and amiable and friendly and polite and respectful that it's hard to nail down exactly what is setting your warning signals off. Sort of tonal contrast between his friendliness and his obvious darkness is really compelling.
Yeah, rewatching this whenever Morden shows up for the first time. Of course, this is the episode we had Bethany on too. And listening to y'all geek out about that. And now that I've seen the rest of this season and another season and a half, have a much greater context for how important he is to the show, I was like, oh, that's why this is called Sign's Importance, him right here. It was really good. I like the stuff he's pulling out here. I hadn't really thought about. I remember noticing either going into the coffee or coming out of the coffee that we were doing a visual transition. I don't think I connected that it was bookended by the coffee, and that is cool. I like that. Lots of really good points there, Mahatma Randy. Really glad to have you commenting on the show because there's a lot of good stuff. Everyone's comments are really, really welcome and been enjoyable. And we're not done yet. So I have an email from Scott McFadden on signs and on portents. Scott says, hello again. Hello again, Scott. It's only been a few minutes since we talked to you, but we're glad you're writing in. He says, well, what can I say about signs and portents? Evidently, Scott, you can say 3 paragraphs. He says, I feel as constrained as Bethany did. Almost everything that I want to say at this point would be a spoiler. So I will just say that you guys did a fine episode about a very important episode. I appreciated the behind the scenes stories about Ed Vosser and how he came to be cast. I don't think that I ever noticed that he was also in The Gathering. But then I can't remember the last time that I watched The Gathering. Okay, so I'm watching the episodes along the way. I'm doing a rewatch as our discussion episodes for the podcast drop. And whenever Blaine and I got to a particular point in season 3, I was like, okay, I want to be sharing this with someone. And so Mindy, my girlfriend, and I have been starting to watch the series. So it's like my 3rd time be going through these first season episodes. And I did notice in The Gathering, the officer on, I think it's in the CNC, who was played by Ed Vosser. And I was like, oh, I know that face. So that was cool to see. I like that. Scott goes on to say, still, it's nice that JMS remembered him and decided that there was a way to use him after all. One of the most interesting things about his appearance here is that initially, Morden's storyline seems to be the B plot of the episode. Only gradually do we start to get hints, portents, if you will, that this guy is going to be something more. That's some good writing to structure the episode in that way. Yeah, good point. Morden seems very unimportant and inconsequential and almost like a what is this guy even doing here kind of storyline for a good chunk of the episode until towards the end. Because like he's just going around talking to people like, what do you want? What do you want? It's like, why do you care? What do you want? But yeah. Scott says, I agree with the general comments about how good the show was when Peter Jurassic and Andreas Katsoulis got to play off each other. And we haven't even gotten to the best scenes yet. Neither one of them ever became big stars. They were both character actors who rarely get a huge amount of acclaim, but both of them were magnificent actors, and it's always a joy to see people at work who really know what they're doing. I have to imagine that they enjoyed performing those scenes as much as we enjoy watching them. That's probably fair to assume.
I think so, yeah.
I also want to agree with John's comments, thank you, Scott, about how Sinclair has gotten so much stronger as the season has gone by. I think that Michael O'Hare got a reputation for being wooden, for want of a better word, early on. Unfortunately, for a lot of fans, that impression seems to have stuck even after it stopped being accurate. I always kind of liked Sinclair, and I appreciate his best buds relationship with Garibaldi. Again, with the whole midnight on the firing line thing, he is very stark in that, but he's also dealing with some really hard situations. And like, there's just, like you said earlier, there's not a lot of room for him as a character to be something other than the military commanding officer in charge, you know? And when he does get a chance to be a person, not just a uniform, he is. But anyways. And Scott says, well, look at that. I guess I did find something to say after all. Keep up the good work, and I'll see you next time.
All right. Thank you, Scott.
And that was our last Scott. Thank you, Scott.
We have one more.
No, yep, I totally lied. That was not our last Scott. No, thank you, Scott.
Okay. We do have another email from Ryan Wilson here. He says, Signs and Portents. Obviously one of my favorite episodes from season 1. It's arc heavy and moves most of the story stuff forward in some way. We somehow get a bit more about why Sinclair is the commander. I'm glad they addressed why a commander is running the station on a captain or admiral or someone more senior. I like seeing strategy used while fighting off the raiders. This always felt like clearing the deck of a minor adversary before you move on to another one. Mr. Morden. My compliments to his tailor. He's just asking questions. What could go wrong? Why did the ambassadors even bother to meet with Morden, especially Delenn? Is there any way to answer without spoilers? I'm just going to assume that part of being ambassador means you have to be approachable and have people come, especially when you're approached by someone of another species.
And yet also when I think of ambassador, I think of a very busy person who doesn't have time for little people. So I don't know. But yeah.
And Ryan's last comment on Signs and Portents is, we actually get Kosh speaking directly this time. That's when I get worried. And then he goes on to say, TKO, Babylon 5 Fight Club. I'm surprised to see this is the lowest rated episode of the series. I do think there are a couple that are worse, but to each their own. And yeah, it's not just the lowest rated, it's the lowest rated by a margin, so I think I should look at the actual distribution. I don't know if you guys know this, but if you go to the IMDb and click on the actual rating, it shows you how many 10 out of 10s, how many 9s, how many 8s, and breaks it down by some demographics as well. So you can, they were doing this even before things started getting review bombed by people who didn't like it when The Little Mermaid was tanned. But you can go through and see that. So I'm wondering if maybe this was hit by people who just don't like combat sports. Because while I find it hard to imagine it's really in anybody's top 10. The gap in ratings between TKO and the second lowest episode seems unwarranted. I don't think it's as low as the rating says. Continuing with Ryan's comments.
I still came away from that episode thinking, wow, I didn't actually need any of that at all. But, I mean, people like what they like, so there's a demographic of the audience that is going to enjoy that story, and there's a demographic of the writing that tried to reach that kind of storytelling. So no shade on anyone for liking it or on them for doing it. I just don't think it was a success for me. And the ratings would tend to say that a lot of people agree, but that doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah, I think it was clear when we covered it that the A plot didn't really work for us, but the B plot did, which is kind of what Ryan alludes to when he continues. Without getting into the minute specific details, some cultural notes. Shiva after a family death is generally sat by the family for 7 days. So Shiva is 7 in Hebrew.
You know, as much random Hebrew things as I know, counting to 10 is not one of them. So thank you, Ryan.
The rabbi at the end says something along the lines of, this place, Nes Gadol. And I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciations. That's my comment, not Ryan's. I'm sure he's pronouncing it correctly. The rabbi is saying that Babylon 5 is a great miracle. That's what Nes Gadol translates to. On dreidels, there are 4 letters that represent the phrase Nes Gadol, Hayasham, which means a great miracle happened there.
So context on that, there's a dreidel is a top that instead of being circular on the equator, it's 4-sided. So it's spinning on the bottom, but it comes up to a 4-sided shape. And each of those sides is a Hebrew letter. So the N letter for Nes, the G letter for Gadol, the H letter for Haya, and the Esh letter for Sham, which they have different purposes. Their primary purpose is probably as a children's toy, but they would also be used like dice. So for lots and for gambling and randomness and stuff like that. So that's what a dreidel is.
Okay. The only Hebrew letter I am familiar with is the Aleph, because the different sizes of infinity are the smallest possible infinity is Aleph naught, and then the next smallest is Aleph 1, and the next smallest is Aleph 2, and there's countably infinitely many infinities.
Interesting. I did not know that mathematics had Hebrew. There's so much Greek in math that I didn't expect that.
Yeah, the Greek and Latin alphabets are extremely well represented. To my knowledge, this is the only Hebrew letter that made it in. And my personal YouTube channel does have a little video about how many infinities there are and if there's more than one and how we know that. So if anyone's interested, you could find that.
And to those that are listening, yes, I know what the letters are named. I just figured I'd say something more useful than the names of the letters. Anyways.
So Ryan concludes by saying, now our second pause begins. I'll see you back in January for more of Season 1. Satisfactory eating to you. So thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan. All right. Going back to YouTube, FSM Dog. Is this our first FSM Dog?
I believe it is.
He says on TKO, one of the subs, one throwaway line that returns, watch your back, Garibaldi.
Yeah, that really should have been mentioned in Giving Form to the Dream. I think I missed it, so thank you for catching that.
Thank you for giving form to our dreams, FSM Dog.
And now, Scott McFadden sends an email titled TKO. So at last we get to TKO. Of course I knew, as most fans do, that this is pretty much everyone's vote for least favorite episode. Well, apparently not everyone, but you just say pretty much everyone. It's a popular vote. I don't dislike it quite as much as that, but it's all because of the Ivanova plotline. I agree with your assessment that Ivanova's story is well done and quite touching, while all the fighting stuff is very forgettable. There was a time in my life when I was seriously thinking of converting to Judaism. I didn't end up doing so, but for that reason this episode resonated with me strongly. I think it would also resonate with anyone who has lost someone close. Both my parents are gone now, so I can relate to Ivanova's grief as well as her reluctance to really deal with that grief. This part of the episode is written and performed very well. It's always fun to see Theodore Bikel in any role. Fun fact, in addition to his many film and television roles, he also originated the part of Captain Von Trapp in the stage version of The Sound of Music and genuinely accompanied himself on the guitar when he sang Edelweiss.
That's fantastic. I did not know that.
As for the fighting plotline, well, what can I say? It doesn't add anything to either the episode or the larger B5 mythos. When I remember it at all, it always gets mixed up in my mind with that one episode of Star Trek Voyager where 7 of 9 had to fight Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Did she really?
She did. Dwayne Johnson does show up as a character early in his wrestling career. So
Yeah, that would be early in his career, yeah. Wow, yeah. I didn't know that. I guess I either have seen it and did not make the connection, because whenever I watched through Voyager, I don't think I knew what a Dwayne Johnson was. Or I haven't seen the episode yet because the last 2 seasons of Voyager I have still not watched.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure which it is because I don't remember it clearly enough to remember which season it was in, because it's been a few years, and when I actually did, I kind of fell out of Voyager early because some of the bad science really annoyed me. And as we've said before, I think original series and the various animated series, so not just the original, but also Prodigy and Lower Decks, those are the ones that knew the show they were going to be in season, actually not even Lower Decks as much, but season 1 and 2 is a bit of a growth. I think Lower Decks really found itself in season 3. That is a serious tradition with a lot of Trek. So when I came back to Voyager, I did find that seasons 5 and 6 are some of the best of Trek. Like John mentioned earlier, the 3rd and 4th seasons of Enterprise, especially season 4, when Manny Cotto took over as show writer, you take out that season premiere where he was cleaning up someone else's plot lines, and you take out the season finale that wasn't really on Manny Cotto and made some choices.
Yeah, that series finale is a whole thing.
Yeah.
But discarding that.
Yeah, honestly, the season finale had 2 good ideas, but one of those good ideas should not have been in this series finale. They had an idea that could have been fantastic for a February Sweeps episode, and they put it at the end, and that was a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so Scott concludes by saying, I'll be waiting impatiently through the hiatus. As I recall, there are some pretty good episodes coming up as we finish up season 1. Well, hopefully this feedback episode helps you get through that hiatus.
Yeah. We only have a couple more weeks before we get to the next broadcast episode. So yeah. All right. And our last proper email, and I think our last feedback, comes from Douglas Adamson. Sorry, Douglas. For a consolidated feedback single message, he says, "Hello, Blaine and John." Hello, Douglas. "I'm very behind in all of the feedback I owe to so many podcasts. But seeing there is a gap next month for Babylon 5 30 years later, I thought it best to consolidate all my feedback since the last feedback episode, so you don't need to read out my name so many times as last time." Well, I mean, we obviously don't mind reading out people's names multiple times, because if we had to pay everyone $1 for every time they put their name in, well, some of you would be a lot richer than others. Douglas says, "First of all, I'd like to congratulate you both for maintaining the quality of this show." Aw, thank you.
Thank you very much.
While I would have been perfectly fine with just the pair of you for the rest of the season coverage and all the way to the end of the show in 4 years' time, I was very impressed with your guests on the show. Bethany was a great guest, full of enthusiasm for the show, and I thought she did well in not spoiling John and other listeners who are new to B5. However, it's clear that, like many of us, she knew things were going to get much better. I have to admit, I was really surprised when Mark Scott Zickery turned up for Survivors. He brought some incredible insight, and the interaction between the three of you sparked very well. I will also say I was very surprised when Mark Scott Zickery showed up for the episode. I thought that was a pretty good land by Blaine. He gets all the credit for that, for contacting the people who made that happen.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when he agreed to as well. He was very welcome. And yeah, a big shout out to Tom Elliott of the Twilight Zone podcast, who let me know how to make that happen.
Douglas goes on to say there are so few writers on the show. In general, it was great to hear how JMS handled dealing with not writing an episode himself. I have to admit, I didn't know much about Mark's other works. I didn't realize he was also involved with Captain Power, for example. But of course, it's clear that without Mark's involvement with JMS and Doug, Netter and John Copeland and putting them together, there wouldn't be Babylon 5. It's funny how that all worked out. I'm really looking forward to the next batch of episodes, as I know that this is where the idling engine of the show starts accelerating and won't slow down for a long, long while. He says that. I'm just thinking about what all happens left in this season. And to be honest, I'm having a hard time remembering some of the details. So, I'll be curious to see how that engine acceleration plays out on this next time through.
Yeah, we're not far from our first two-parter, if you recall that.
Mm-hmm.
That would be part of it. And then, of course, the season 1 finale is...
Yeah, Chrysalis I remember very well. A lot of what happens between now and then I don't really remember. In fact, Babylon Squared, if I remember what that is, I know that has not been in my head for a while, because there have been several times where I've thought about that story concept. I'm like, I know we talked about that, but I don't actually remember it happening. So it'll be good to revisit that episode. Douglas says, let's see. What is
last paragraph?
Thank you both for the show. I've shared it with a number of my Babylon 5 friends. In the meantime, since I've also listened to a number of other B5 podcasts and they just haven't clicked with me, honestly, I find your informative approach without excessive editorializing and just as importantly, family friendly is perfect for me to listen to. And the pair of you have been company on weekend mornings as I do some homework. I'll be here for the long run. Doug Adamson. I think my language slips from time to time. Blaine might be better about editing that out when it happens. But other than that, yeah, we want to keep this show as wide an audience as possible.
Yeah, that's something I decided a long time ago to make it family friendly. And actually, I don't remember ever having to, or I think there's maybe once in the whole run we've done so far. And that's, as you said, we're about halfway through season 3. We're actually past the halfway point. I think there's maybe once I had to edit language. I think the fact that we both teach for our day jobs means it's not hard to stay clean. But I don't typically use profanity when I'm not at work. So, yeah, I like that. And I also appreciate it in podcasts because there's some excellent podcasts, particularly Science Versus and Math Therapy are two fantastic podcasts that I would love to share with students, but sometimes I can't because they get kind of potty mouthed. And when you, a couple of years ago, it ended a couple of years ago, but I had a 4-year stint at a faith-based school for Sikhs, and it was a challenge to share some, like the Math Therapy podcast has really good episodes about, why students struggle with math, what turns them off of math, what we could do to help. And there's a couple episodes that would have been great for some of my students to listen to that I could not directly share with them because of the language used. So if you are okay with the potty mouths, Math Therapy is fantastic in that regard. And Science Versus has some wonderful things, like actually digging into a lot of the science and what the research actually says about things that are coming up in politics, not really taking partisan sides. They're letting the science guide them. And there are times where it's like, oh, that is what they say. Well, that's surprising. I expected the opposite, that kind of thing. So really good model for let's try to check our biases at the door and see what is actually coming out in the world.
Whenever I first made an attempt at watching Babylon 5 4 years ago, I did look for podcasts to kind of go with me on the journey because I knew it was one of those shows that had a lot going on under the surface. And there was a show I found that I believe was just called the Babylon 5 Intro Cast. It might have had another name, but they're the ones who introduced me to the idea and put a name on it. The idea of having multiple hosts on a show where one is very knowledgeable and one is completely, newbie to the material. And that intro cast concept is one that Blaine and I have decided to pick up and run with, not only for this show, but for future plans as well. I think it is a fun way to approach material that has depth and mystery and rewatch value. Because you get both. You get the first person's perspective and the rewatch perspective to an extent at the same time. So, I'm glad that it's working for everyone. And yeah, as far as the filter on the show, I do like, a healthy teaspoon of profanity mixed into my language when I'm not at work. But, I tell every student at school, I physically install the filter before I come in every morning. So if I can do it, you can too. And it's not hard to do when you sit down at a microphone. But yeah, so that's the end of our feedback episode. We had another one, Blaine. We weren't even sure we were going to get one, and now we've done 2.
Yes, and hopefully we could do 3 or more. Because we have currently planned 17 feedback episodes by the time we're all said and done.
Because of all the various breaks in the recording and everything. But you don't have to worry about 17. You just have to worry about the next one. So we're about to come back from our podcast break, which is the next new episode will be released on July 6th, 2024. So that's in 2 weeks. That's going to be covering episode 115, which is called Grail. And we have a 7 episode run. Before we get to the end of season 1, which, if you're unaware, the end of season 1 is actually after another break. So they did save that finale, and we will grouse about that when we get there, because I remember having feelings about it.
Yeah, we'll be grousing about that more than once.
Yeah, over the course of July and August, feel free to continue sending in your feedback about the episodes. And over the fall gap in recording, we'll come back with another feedback special and the first of another series of specials I think we've hinted at. But yeah, we'll talk more about that as we get close to it. But we're going to be taking the opportunity to look at other works that JMS has done besides Babylon 5. So more on that as we get closer.
Yeah, we'll be probably much more specific. We do have a feedback episode slotted before it. So
yes.
I don't know. I don't remember if we named it when we covered episode 21 before the break, or if we saved it till after. But
I'll know when we get there because I'll listen to them, and you'll know because you'll edit them.
Yep. So we'll announce no later than our next feedback special what we're covering in case you want to watch those other works as well.
All right. So do be here in a couple of weeks for Grail, and until then, thank you very much for listening.
And good eating to you.